we've got an we've got an ASAD model, we've got the long run, we've got the short run. We've already seen that we can use it to sort of talk a little bit about unemployment, and we will talk more about unemployment, and we're going to use it to talk about growth as well as inflation. So, first of all, economic growth and inflation in this ASAD model. Talk about it. My bad. So, first of all, growth and inflation, we talk about it now, and then we'll talk about it again at the beginning of chapter 29. So, how do we get economic growth? Economic growth results from either growing labor force, in other words, remember production, Y is a function of labor, what else? Capital, what else? Technology, yeah? Remember this? Chapter 24? Production, what goes into your production function? The primary factors, labor, capital, technology, the state of technology, T. So, economic growth results from a growing labor force or increasing labor productivity, which is what we would call T, which together make potential GDP growth. Sorry, an increase in labor productivity is T or K, depending, right? So, there's 2A and 2B. Labor productivity increases due to either capital or technology changes. So there are three ways in which economic growth can occur. That's growth in output. Economic growth, so we're talking about output. We can also have a growth in prices or change in prices, which is what we call inflation. And inflation results from growing quantity of money, AD, that outpaces the growth of potential GDP. Okay, so there's quite a lot in that statement. But what this statement here is basically describing is this diagram. When we have economic growth, the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts. Why? Well, remember... Oh, wrong one, sorry. Remember our long-run aggregate supply curve, the position of Y star is based on the labor market and our associated production function. If capital increases or labor becomes more productive or the state of technology increases, what happens to our production function? It shifts upwards and our labor demand shifts to the right, which would mean Y star increases, right? If Y star increases, what happens to the long-run aggregate supply curve? It would shift to the right, yeah? I had that other diagram. Hang on, let's see. There it is. Remember? Oh. Oh, man. Okay, so if Y star increases, if Y increases, long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Yeah? So here we have our long-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. Why? Because we've got either growing labor force or we've got labor productivity growing because of either capital or technology. Okay? Now, we can also have an increase in aggregate demand. Now, what this statement is saying is that the primary increase in aggregate demand here is coming from a growing quantity of money, which betrays, I guess, in some sense, a sort of an ideological bias there. But obviously, if you increase the quantity of money, so we increase the supply of money, we know that that shifts demand to the right. Yeah? Increase the supply of money, it shifts demand to the right. Yeah? Increase supply of money, interest rates go down, investment goes up, AD shifts to the right. Yeah? Okay. So, yes, one of the things that can shift the AD to the right would be a growing quantity of money. Now, if in this example that growth in the quantity of money or the growth in money supply was greater, so in other words, the aggregate demand curve shifted by more than what the long-run aggregate supply curve shifted. So if our aggregate demand is increasing faster than our supply is increasing, In other words, we want more goods and services. Our demand for goods and services is growing at a faster rate than what we can actually start producing more goods and services, yeah? Long run aggregate supply, that's our actual output. When we start wanting more than we can actually produce, our aggregate demand is growing faster than our aggregate supply. What happens to the price level? It increases. I mean, our equilibrium output also increases, but our price level increases along with it. Okay? So here we have economic growth along with inflation. And what tends to be, shall we say, consensus on these matters is that a small bit of inflation is actually good for economic growth. Having economic growth, in other words, an increase in output with a little bit of inflation, it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a pretty good thing. What's really bad is deflation. If prices are going down, that's a problem. Okay? But a little bit of inflation, that's good. No problem with that at all. So if we look then at fluctuations in aggregate demand, one reason that our actual GDP might fluctuate around its potential, right, or in other words, why we might have a business cycle, one of the reasons that we might go up sometimes and down sometimes, is that we could be moving away from the long run aggregate supply, and we're moving away because of, one of the reasons is demand side factors. So our aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. In other words, it shifts by more than what the long run aggregate supply curve shifts. We move away, okay, from the long run. What is going to be the response in this case? If aggregate demand shifts to the right, away from, so that we have a short run equilibrium away from our long run equilibrium, we have a bit of inflation and we've got output growing, but our output is growing faster than our actual aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply. What is going to be the response? Price levels go up, and then what's the response in the economy from the supply side? Supply does decrease. Why does it decrease? The prices of the factors of production start increasing as well. And the one that we're most concerned with is the price of labor, right? So price level starts going up generally. What happens? The price of labor also starts going up, the nominal wage, right? Remember, if prices are going up but nominal wages are staying fixed, then real wages are going down. That's how we employ more people than our long run full employment level. Once this kind of becomes clear that that's what's happening, nominal wages start increasing as well. When nominal wages increase, what happens to the aggregate supply curve in the short run? It shifts to the left. Okay? So we might move away from our full employment and then we move back towards full employment. Right? Okay? So one of the reasons that we could have fluctuations is because of changes in aggregate demand. Another reason could be, well, changes in supply. What happens if we go into, I say we the people, we the laborers in this instance, the workers. We go into negotiations and we say, listen, we want 10% increase in wages. And it's a vicious negotiation, but we win and we get our 10%. Fantastic. Over the next year, our wages are going to be increased by 10%. What happens is that the price level increases only by 1%. What's happened to our real wage? It's gone up, and it's gone up by quite a lot. I mean, it's like a 9% increase in real wage. That's quite a lot, right? With that increase in real wages, right, or first of all, with the increase in nominal wages, we have a shift to the left in our aggregate supply curve. But our aggregate supply curve, you can see, has shifted to the left by more than what our aggregate demand curve might have shifted to the right. Okay? So we've gone backwards. we've got unemployment. Why have we got unemployment? Because our real wages have increased by more than what our productivity has increased, right? Let's say we had a real increase of 9% in real wages. It's unlikely that your productivity is increased by that amount. It's unlikely that that increase in real wages is going to be matched by employers saying, oh yes, we're definitely happy to pay higher real wages, right? They're probably going to say, well, we're paying higher real wages, now we need to employ less people. Okay? So we have a decrease in employment, we have a decrease in output and inflation. Why do we have inflation? Well, remember, the costs of producing have gone up. Nominal wages have gone up and real wages have gone up. So the cost of producing has gone up. What is going to be the response in this case? Well, we don't have it here, but the likely response is either that real wages must fall because nominal wages must decrease and aggregate supply shifts back to the right, but it's not often that wages get negotiated down, right? So what will tend to happen is there will be an increase in aggregate demand. Where does that increase in aggregate demand come from? Well, look, we've got a recession. As soon as we have a recession, what tends to happen? Politicians get aggravated, right? People are unhappy. We are unemployed. Politicians say, well, we can't have this. What do? We increase spending, right? Reserve Bank, print more money. Government, spend more money. Right? Either of those are going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Once aggregate demand shifts to the right, we can come back to a long-run equilibrium point with even higher prices. And then real wages decrease once again. Okay? So if we look at these two examples here and we call this point A, and we call, let me just check what they call it, and we call this point here point C, okay? So here's point A, we've moved away from this long run equilibrium, let's call it B. And here's point C, we moved away from the long run equilibrium, point B. Well, if we put all three of these diagrams together, there's our point A example, here's our point C example. And we think about what that would look like over time if this was year one and then we return to full employment year two. Then we have negotiations for wages year three, which pushes us into recession. What is our business cycle going to look like over this period? So this is year one, year two, year three. Well, here we go. Here's year one. We've moved away from GDP, potential GDP. We've gone up. Then in year two, we come back to potential GDP. Year three, we move down, away from potential GDP. And then hopefully in year four, we start moving back. And we've got a cyclical story going on there. Okay? Let's stop there. Any questions? Yeah, no? Okay. So then your three main schools of thought for what is going on here. Remember, we've spoken already about classical and Keynesian, so we're going to just talk a little bit more classical, Keynesian versus something called the monetarist view. The monetarist view sort of emerged in the 60s, I guess. So these are separate views, classical view, Keynesian view. So classical view is sort of pre-1930s, Keynesian view 1930s, monetarist view 1960s. Then you have something called the Neoclassical Synthesis, which is kind of like, if we take the Keynesian stuff and we mix it with some of the classical stuff and some of the monetarist stuff, we get something called the Neoclassical Synthesis, which is sort of the 1980s. And then after the 1980s, it's just a case of within the neoclassical synthesis, is it more Keynesian stuff or is it more classical stuff that we're dealing with? Right? And then that's the sort of debate, 80s and 90s. Then in the 2000s, it's there's this idea that no, we've got macroeconomics figured out. It's called the new neoclassical synthesis, right? And then we have the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And the argument thereafter is, hang on a minute, in this whole discussion about the new neoclassical synthesis, there's very little attention being paid to the role of money, surprisingly. And also, the role in which money plays, the assumption is, what we've been talking about, that the Reserve Bank controls the money supply. It's vertical. The Reserve Bank controls it. But we've moved into an era where, in fact, let's say a large number of reserve banks, and especially the reserve banks of the world's leading economies, don't try and control money supply. What they try and control is inflation. And they try and control inflation by controlling the interest rate. So instead of having a vertical money supply, we should really be modeling a horizontal money supply. Okay? We haven't done that. As I say, that's post-2007 stuff. We're still doing the basics. Okay? But the next story is, why do some of these things not predict what we saw 2007, 2008? And one of the reasons is, well, you've got the money market wrong. Which is interesting. So, what is the classical view? If we summarize what the classical people, or let's say the classical proponents, believe. The economy is self-regulating and it's always at full employment. So what are aggregate demand fluctuations driven by? Primarily it's driven by changes in technology. So you have a change in technology that shifts aggregate demand. But remember, if the economy itself is self-regulating and you kind of assume that all information gets disseminated relatively quickly, any shift or change in aggregate demand is met by what? A pretty let's say a swift response in terms of time by a shift in aggregate supply. Okay? So what drives aggregate demand fluctuations? Technology. What is the aggregate supply response? The money wage rate that lies behind the short-run aggregate supply is almost instantly and completely flexible. So as soon as you have a change in demand, you have a change in supply because money wage rates adjust almost immediately and by pretty much the correct amount. That's the classical story. So what are the policy implications of holding a classical view? Your policy implication should surely be to say, government, just don't get involved. The economy is going to sort itself out, right? So if you come in with tax breaks or tax incentives or any kind of fiscal policy measures, you're messing with the system. If you come in with any kind of government spending, you come in with any kind of, monetary policy measures, you want to start messing with the interest rates, you're messing with the system. Leave it alone. It's going to sort itself out. That's the classical view. So the classical view, there's this basically, they would emphasize that there's a potential for taxes to mess with the system. Just don't do it, guys. Don't do it. That's sort of a classical view. Remember, the Keynesian view was kind of a response to the classical view, like an antithesis in a sense. It said, well, yeah, your view of no government intervention, that's great, but remember, in the long run, we're all dead. We would like maybe some change to happen slightly quicker than in the long run, which is what you say is going to happen. So the Keynesian view says that the economy, if left alone, it's not usually going to operate at the full employment level, and that in order to achieve full employment, what you want to do as a government is kind of actively be involved in fiscal and monetary policy, right? Continuously. Oh, we're a little bit too far ahead. Okay, we'll bring it back. We're a little bit too far behind. Okay, push it forward, right? That's the Keynesian view. You should be involved. So why do we have aggregate demand fluctuations? And they say, well, mostly it's because of expectations. So remember we said that consumption, one of the things that influences, that shifts aggregate demand is a change in consumption. And a change in consumption can be driven by expectations. Expectations about what you think is going to happen in the future. But also investment spending is largely driven by expectations. I think the economy is going to do well in the future. I'm going to invest now. I'm going to buy machinery now. I'm going to build a factory now. because I think I'm going to be able to sell. I don't think I'm going to be able to sell in the future. Okay, I'm not going to buy machinery now. Of course, what happens to aggregate demand if you decide not to spend on investment? Aggregate demand decreases, that's correct. What happens to output and spending if aggregate demand decreases? Output goes down. What do you think that does for your expectations about what the economy is going to do in the future if the economy is going backwards at the moment? You're like, well, hang on a minute, I think I'm just not going to spend because it's kind of going backwards. I'm going to just wait and see. So you don't spend. Then what happens? Aggregate demand decreases even more. What happens to output? Decreases even more. So what happens to your investment decisions? Ooh, no, the economy's got even worse. I think I'm just going to hold up for a little while, right? That's called a positive feedback loop, except in this case, positive is a misleading word, right? But positive means that it builds on itself. So this feedback loop, which is negative, is feeding on itself. So one of the arguments in the Keynesian story then is if expectations are one of the significant drivers of aggregate demand, what government should do is be influencing expectations. Aggregate demand falls, well, increase government spending to stop output falling. When you stop output falling, you stop those negative expectations. Right? One of the things that the Keynesian guys say that on the aggregate supply curve side, remember we said the money wage doesn't fall. What happens if your money wage is sticky? It doesn't adjust immediately. Okay? That's what we illustrated in our diagrams here. Oh my goodness. Remember, if the money wage rate is sticky, what happens? When you have a decrease in aggregate demand, we have this decrease in output, decrease in employment, so an increase in unemployment. And the Keynesian story is we can sit there for a while. We're going to sit here as long as the wages don't adjust. Yeah? So the Keynesian story, the supply side, well, the money wage, it doesn't adjust. And especially it doesn't adjust downwards. It's very difficult to go into negotiations and ask people to accept a lower wage. It's almost impossible. In that case, where should the stimulus from the economy come from? The government is what the Keynesian story would be. So, policy response needed. Fiscal and monetary policy to actively offset changes in aggregate demand. Government should be involved. To give you an example of how difficult the discussion about Keynesian government involvement might be, the idea would be if we are below full employment, government should be spending. A good indication of whether government is spending too much is if we have sharp increases in inflation. Happy with that? Okay. In the South African economy at this point in time, what is our unemployment rate looking like? Pretty horrendous, right? It's about 27%. What do you think our historic norm is for the sort of 10 to 20 years before that? It's about 24, 25%. Right? Does that mean that we've always been in a recession? Have we been in some 20-year recession? Or is our full employment level of unemployment just really, really high? Okay? Let's say we've been in a recession. Actually, this unemployment story is not a structural story. It's a cyclical story. Government could increase spending, we would get more people employed. And that's the story that you hear at every election. Right? Every election. Government is going to spend, people are going to get employed. Right? What happens when we see increases in government, extensive increases in government spending? We don't see much of a change in output, employment, first of all. Number one. Number two, what is our inflation looking like at the moment? Well, it's actually not looking that bad. It's looking at around 5.5%. the target is 3 to 6%, right? So we're towards the top end of the target, yeah? But, we're not out of the target. So we've got relatively high inflation without, well, let's say with high unemployment. Government spending, what tends to happen is very small changes in employment, right? So the question now is, should the government be just increasing spending even more, right? Is it just not spending enough? Well, that's the other argument, yeah. Okay, well, that's a different argument. But it's a good point. The government is spending a lot, that's the point, right? So if it were to increase its spending, what can we expect to happen? Well, the point raised was, what is government currently spending its money on? Well, it needs to, in the next couple of days, pump 10 billion rand into SAA. That's what it has to do in the next couple of days. Otherwise, SAA has a problem. So there's a big argument, I don't know if you've seen it in the press, about the PIC. That's the Public Investment Corporation. So remember, the biggest employer, and especially the biggest employer of, let's say, educated, so and I use the word educated, I'll explain what I mean, but the biggest employer of educated black people is government, right? So obviously there's a large number of very unskilled black laborers that are employed in the mining sector. Then there's obviously very skilled black laborers employed within the economy generally, right? But the biggest employer of educated black laborers is government. So government's one of the biggest employers in the whole economy, right? All of those employers contribute money to the Public Investment Corporation, and the Public Investment Corporation invests those employees' funds. Those are their pensions. Okay? So the largest holder of black pensions is the PIC. And there's a big, I don't know what to call it, smoke and mirrors. Let's say, like, people are making accusations, people are saying it's not true. But the argument is the PIC is a big, massively, as yet untapped source of, if we want to call it captured funds, call it captured funds. SAA needs 10 billion rand, it needs 10 billion rand quickly. If SAA was well run, it could go to the markets and get 10 billion rand without a problem. The reason it can't get 10 billion rand through the markets is because no one in the markets wants to lend 10 billion rand to SAA. The market has turned around and said, until you have changed the management structure of SAA, we are not comfortable giving you 10 billion rand. Remember, the management structure of SAA is determined primarily by the ANC in Parliament, right? The concern at this point is that Treasury, which needs to bail SAA out, is going to turn to the PIC to ask for that 10 billion. The Treasury has said, we're definitely not going to do that. But remember, the Treasury is run by Gigaba. And remember, Gigaba is the guy who fast-tracked the Gupta's SAA citizenship. He was also the guy who was in charge of all those state-owned entities. He was in charge, before he was finance minister, of SAA. He was the minister in charge of SAA, of Denel, of Transnet, etc. He was the minister in charge when those things were, let's say, not doing very well. And he's the guy who's now in charge of Treasury. And he has said, no, we're not going to the PIC. I promise you, we're not. The arguments that are surfacing, and again, it's smoke and mirrors. Who's telling the truth? Who's not? I know where I would put my money, put it that way. The argument has been that the guy who's in charge of the PIC at this point in time doesn't want to give money to the SAA. He has said, no, I'm not investing in these institutions, right? The argument at the moment is that there are plans afoot to get him out So, yeah. It is interesting times. We'll see what happens. So yes, government could be spending 10 billion rand not on SAA. And that would probably be a good thing. If we're spending 10 billion rand on, for example, road infrastructure to, areas where you want to build up an economy in, less developed areas, right? You want to help rural areas be more economically sustainable? Well, get more roads. 10 billion rand is going to buy you quite a bit of road. And remember, 10 billion rand, that's on top of all the other billions that SAA has already had. This is not the only 10 billion rand that SAA is going to be bailed out with. There was a 15 billion rand before that, and there was a couple of billion rand before that. I think there was a 6 billion rand before that somewhere. Every year, SAA gets money. Not looking good. Yeah. So the argument is that it's not well run. But one of the arguments about why it's not well run is because the money also that it gets doesn't necessarily go where it's supposed to go. So, for example, one of the big spending items, if you want to call it that, couple of million rands, is money paid to consultants. Consultants who have connections with the Guptas. Remember that the chair of the SAA is Dudu Mayeni. Remember that Dudu Mayeni is the chair of the Jacob Zuma Foundation, right? There's been a lot of effort over the last 5 years to get her out. She hasn't. She is still there, and she's the chair, so she, has a lot of power in saying what SAA does. Remember that Transnet bought a whole lot of trains, and the trains didn't work on our railways, right? And the contract that was negotiated, in order for that contract to be negotiated, was achieved through a negotiator, right? And that negotiator company had big connections to the Guptas, right? So they got paid some huge payment to facilitate this train company getting the contract, right? There's this current thing now where the guy from something called Just Coal admitted on radio, I don't know why, he just admitted paying 500,000 rand to the ANC Youth League, right, to help facilitate the non-cancellation of their coal contract to Eskom. It didn't happen. Their contract was still cancelled, and they were unhappy because they'd paid 500,000 to the ANC Youth League to get this thing not cancelled. Anyway, these are fun times. So we've had the classical view, we've had the Keynesian view. Now we're going to have a view that's kind of in between the two, which is the monetarist view. The monetarist view, macroeconomists who are monetarists would believe that the economy is pretty self-regulating. Okay, so that's a kind of a classical view, right? It's pretty self-regulating. And that it's actually normally going to operate at full employment provided that monetary policy is not erratic. So they put a lot of emphasis, surprise, surprise, monetarists, they put a lot of emphasis on monetary policy. So their argument is when you have fluctuations away from full employment, the reason you have those fluctuations, the primary reason, is because of fluctuations in aggregate demand, and those fluctuations in aggregate demand are primarily driven by changes in money supply. That's their argument. Okay? So when I said we had this statement over here, that this fluctuation in money, in aggregate demand is primarily a monetary story, that's kind of very much a monetarist influence there. Okay? What is the aggregate supply response in the monetarist model? Well, the monetarist model would say, hang on, the aggregate supply, the nominal wage is not quite flexible, right? The money wage, it doesn't change automatically. Whereas the Keynesian view said, whereas the classical view said, real nominal money wages adjust automatically, basically. Keynesian view said, no, they get stuck. Monetarists also, so here's their Keynesian side. They say, yes, short run, the aggregate supply, nominal wages get stuck. Okay? So our W gets stuck. So if you've got erratic money supply, shifting aggregate demand, here back and forth, but your nominal wages are getting stuck, then you're going to be away from full employment. Continue, as long as your money supply is erratic, you're going to have erratic employment. You're going to be all over the place with your employment. You won't be at full employment, right? That's the monetarist view. So what do you think the monetarist policy response would be? The policy response would be, it's the same as the classical view on fiscal policy. In other words, government, don't get involved, don't mess around with aggregate demand. But secondly, make sure that your money supply is not erratic. So their argument is have a rule for what money supply should be doing. Okay? So monetarist policy is money rules. I say money rules and that sounds wrong. Say a rule for money supply. A rule for money supply. Okay. So always increase money supply by 5% per year. That would be a rule, right? Keep that money supply increasing at a certain amount, then your aggregate demand will increase by a certain amount. Your inflation will increase by a certain amount. Laborers can then make decisions knowing what they can expect inflation to be. They will adjust their wages appropriately, and we will always be at full employment. That's the nominal, that's the money monetarist view. And then that brings us to the end where we have an ASAD question. Righty-ho. We've still got 10 minutes, but maybe we should just end on this question because you're looking a little bit tired. Yeah, politics in this country is pretty tiring. I agree. Okay, so do you want to do this question and then we'll head off? Okay? Let's talk through it. You've got an ADAS model, you've got a long run, you've got two different short runs and two different aggregate demands. You've got a bunch of different prices over here and some different levels of output. The question says, if we move from point B to point C, so we're going to move from point B to point C. What happens when we move from point B to point C is the question. So which of these options is correct? Let's look at number one. There is an increase in investment due to lower interest rates and a decreased desire to hold money as an asset. Well, when we move from point B to point C, there's unlikely to be an increase in investments. If anything, there's probably going to be a decrease in investment. And are there going to be lower interest rates? Well, if the price level is increasing, what's that doing to real money supply? It's decreasing real money supply. Remember, real money supply, M over P. P is going up. What's happening to M over P? Going down. If real money supply is going down in our money market, real money supply would be shifting to the left. What would be happening to interest rates? They'd be going up. So if anything, are we going to have a lower interest rate? Unlikely. Okay? We're not likely to have a lower interest rate. We're not likely to have an increase in investment. So number one's looking pretty poor as a choice. Do you want to do these by yourself or do you want to just... A rare response. Option number two. There's a decrease in consumers' real wealth because the purchasing power of their money holdings has decreased. That looks pretty good. If prices are going up from B to C, then yes, your purchasing power is going to be decreasing. And what tends to happen when your purchasing power decreasing is that there is a decrease in your real wealth. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Okay, number 3. An increase in productivity due to the accumulation of capital stock. Well, we've got a shift to the left of this short-run aggregate supply. We've got no change in the long-run aggregate supply, which suggests there's unlikely to be any increase in productivity going on here. And it's unlikely that we are increasing capital stock. Because if we were, we would be expect our long-run supply curve to be shifting. Yeah? Number 4. Sorry, maybe I should just make a point on that increase in capital stock. And I just, from experience, remember when we have an increase in investment, that shifts the short-run aggregate demand curve. Increase in investment would shift just the aggregate demand curve. Okay? Increase in investment shifts aggregate demand. It's an increase in spending. It does not shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. Why not? Because remember, investment spending, when we increase investment, we increase capital, right? That's what investment is. That's where it goes, into capital, right? If we're increasing capital, we should be shifting the long run. Correct? So why, when we talk about an increase in investment, do we not then also talk about a shift in the long-run aggregate supply? And the argument is because, remember, if you're increasing investment spending now, that's now. When we increase investment spending now, that doesn't mean that you've now automatically got new capital. I start spending money on building a factory. Is my factory now ready? No, it takes a while for my factory to get ready, right? I want to start spending to increase the number of machines in my factory. Cool. I start spending, I get some of these machines, but they can't work until I got those ones, so I spend some more and get those ones, etc., right? Just because I increase my investment spending now doesn't mean my capital changes now. Yes, over time, an increase in investment spending will increase capital, right? When it does, the long-run aggregate supply curve will shift. But if all you're told is that investment spending increases, that doesn't mean capital increases. Okay. So just something to be aware of. Investment spending shifts aggregate demand, doesn't shift aggregate supply unless it increases capital in that same period. Okay. I'll probably have to repeat that at some point, but just mental note, I have said it at least once. Okay. Option number 4, an increase in the expected price level leading to higher nominal wage demands. Okay. From B to C, shift in the short-run aggregate supply to the left. That looks good. Why? Well, if we move to point B, it means there was inflation. Our nominal wages remained fixed, right? So if we're at point B, then yes, we're probably going to start expecting price level to be increasing, and we're going to start demanding higher nominal wages. That looks pretty good. So we've got 2 and 4. Now we hope for a 2 and a 4. No, that looks good. 2 and a 4. So next week, Thursday, we do chapter 29. Remember, the beginning of chapter 29 is basically a discussion on the ASAD model anyway. When we do chapter 29, we introduce something called the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is basically the inverse of the aggregate supply curve, the short-run and long-run aggregate supply curve. The inverse of that is the Phillips curve. So again, to do properly in chapter 29, to do it well, to understand what's going on, you got to understand this ASAD. Spend time in the next week, asseblief, right? Get the stuff working in your head. Okay.